So all the time that we've been exploring the development of the Stuart monarchy, its end, and then the English Civil War, and then the restoration of the Church of England, colonies have been developing across the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, and North America that the English have established. Here we're going to focus specifically on the English American colonies. It's worth just noting this is the period of England beginning to develop as an empire. In the late 1500s, under Queen Elizabeth, England begins to colonize in North America and the Caribbean. In 1607, Jamestown, in the colony of Virginia, is settled. Accompanying the colonists is Robert Hunt, a priest of the Church of England. In North America and the Caribbean, and Spain, Portugal, and France all have fewer settlers, colonists, numerically. England has more, even though geographically these other empires have more territory. The English colonists include those who are fleeing persecution, like Puritans, Quakers, Roman Catholics in different time periods, but there's also established Church of England colonies in places like Virginia, North and South Carolina, eventually New York, and some other areas. I just want to walk us through various models of religious life in the Anglican colonies. This will not be exhaustive. We're not going to touch on every single colony, but there's 4 different models I think it's worth us walking through. First is with Massachusetts and Connecticut. These are colonies established by Puritans in the 1620s through 1630s. Neither colony is technically a theocracy insofar as the church doesn't govern civil life, though the 2 spheres of church and civil life are overseen by Puritan concepts of covenant. And indeed, there's a political theory at play here of this notion of overlapping bonds of covenant. There's civil covenants that bond the society together. There's ecclesiastical covenants that exist, and then there's personal covenants like marriage and business contracts that exist. So those overlapping notions of covenantal life are very important for creating a very cohesive notion of society in these 2 colonies. We read for this week John Winthrop's famous text, A Model of Christian Charity, which is composed by him on the Arbella as it is at bay or anchored at sea just along the coast of Massachusetts. John Winthrop is going to be the governor of the colony here, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And he presents this Puritan vision of a Christian commonwealth, that is of the whole body politic in the 1620s. And so not of a state ruled by a monarch, but rather a collective that's bound together by a common vision. And it's a common vision of a covenanted life. And so he speaks to ways in which church and state collaborate and cooperate to bring about a godly society, but also try to keep distinct the different functions of church and state as well. So we're not quite at the notions of separation of church and state that we'll find in later American political thought, but desire still to have a distinctiveness of roles at play. I think it's also important to consider the ways in which this covenantal thinking informs how they will envision their role in society. So I'm going to read from the very end of A Model of Christian Charity. So on page 19 of the anthology American Religions by Marie Griffith that we've assigned for this class. And so this begins about third of the way down. So he is invoking a notion of a creating of a covenant with God and these colonists. He says, "We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and glory, that men shall say of succeeding plantations, that is, succeeding settlements, the Lord make it like that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. So that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world. We shall open the mouths of our enemies to speak evil of the ways of God and all professors for God's sake. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us, till we be consumed out of the good land whither we are going. I think it's really important here to see the very strong Exodus, Deuteronomy, Joshua echoes here. This notion that the settlers are a kind of new Israel entering a new promised land. And there's a sense here that they shall be given a victory over these new Canaanites, the indigenous population, and that God will give them a victory, even though they're outnumbered. But following this Deuteronomistic view of history, that is that if you obey God, God will bless you. If you disobey God, God will curse you. Winthrop reminds them of the very tenuous nature of their enterprise, that if they fall away from following God, they shall be conquered again by their enemies, whether the Canaanites, the indigenous people of Massachusetts, or of their enemies back in England. And this lays forth a notion of manifest destiny, a notion indeed of that doctrine of discovery we've mentioned before, that is that God wills them to take this land from others because they are righteous. This is going to have a very strong effect throughout American Christian thinking, political theology, and secular discourse throughout American history. So it's worth our being attentive to it now. A second model of religious life that we find is a model of toleration in the colonies of Pennsylvania and Rhode Island. So we have here William Penn, a Quaker, helping to establish Pennsylvania. It means Penn's wood in Latin. And Roger Williams, a Baptist, helping to establish Rhode Island. They both are advocating for forms of separation of church and state in order to promote religious toleration. So I believe you read an excerpt from Penn where he argues that people need freedom to exercise their religious conscience. And he argues that religious freedom allows for a stability of civil society. So he argues against this anxiety coming out of the English Civil War context that permitting religious diversity only leads to further bloodshed. Rather, he wants to argue that if we allow religious toleration, that this will somehow harm the state or the Church of England. He argues against this idea, that rather the Church of England should tolerate dissent so it's not known as a persecuting church. So he argues it's better for all parties to allow toleration and permit dissent, because otherwise that is what leads actually to bloodshed. Roger Williams establishes Rhode Island as a different model than Massachusetts in the year 1635. In Rhode Island, Baptists, Congregationalists, Quakers, Anglicans, and Jews are all tolerated. A very similar situation exists in Pennsylvania. However, Roman Catholics are not tolerated in Williams' colony. So this speaks to this notion of a toleration of forms of Protestantism, but a bias still existing in significant ways against Roman Catholics in English society, and that extends across the Atlantic. A third model of toleration, or of religious life rather, is the model of the colony of Virginia. Here we have an example of an establishment of the Church of England as being coterminous with state power. So instead of a separation of religion and society, we really have them coming together. And really this notion of a unity of church and state is imported from English contexts. There is no resident bishop in Virginia or any of the colonies that the English hold. And so churches are governed by a vestry system, laity collaborating with the local clergy. That is going to eventually lead to a distinctiveness of American Anglicanism, distinct from English Anglicans. And I have a whole other course and sets of videos that lays all of that out if you're curious. For those of you enrolled here at Seminary Southwest, you will also be taking a whole course examining the history of the Episcopal Church, where we'll go into much more detail about the Virginia colony. Finally, we have Maryland, where church and state are separated for expediency and economics. One of the things that they're learning from the Pennsylvania experiment is that allowing for religious toleration actually is good economically. It leads to more people coming and more business being transacted. Maryland is founded by the Roman Catholic Calvert family. They're granted land in 1632 by Charles I, and they're settled in 1634. It is established as a colony for Roman Catholics, hence its name, Mary's Land. And in order to avoid persecution of Catholics in case they lose future control of the colony, broad toleration is established in 1649, both again for this political expediency, but then also as it began to look to the experience of Pennsylvania and its own positive economic development. And they were indeed prescient because as part of the restoration of Anglicanism at the end of the 17th century, in 1692, Maryland loses its official Roman Catholic status. It becomes a colony in which the Church of England is the official church of the state. And so Maryland has a really complex history of shifting forms of religious life, but it gives us another window into how the experiment of toleration plays out in an English colonial context. All these different models of religious experimentation are going to inform how the United States eventually develops its own conception of what religious life ought to be and how religion ought to interact with society and with the state. It's going to set the ground for the disestablishment of all churches once the United States becomes a newly independent republic. And that we'll trace out in a future video.